Welcome back, Brighter Morning with Bo. I am Bo Tiwari, and we have MP for Tabaquite, Anita Haynes, on the line, so let's talk with her. Good morning, how are you?
Good morning, I'm fine, thank you. How are you doing?
Good. We're glad to have you on. And
Happy to
we'll talk, today's budget day, how do you feel? How do you feel, how do you feel as an MP? You're representing people. You are alert to what is happening in this society, and you are a member of parliament. You have to anticipate what the budget deliverer, that is to say the Minister of Finance, will deliver on behalf of the government. And you then have to respond to that. What are you thinking and feeling at this point?
Well, I can say I spent my first year as a member of parliament in the midst of a pandemic. The bulk of this year spent in a state of emergency. And a lot of my focus in this first year has been giving a sort of emergency food support and that kind of assistance. And so as we approach this budget, my general way of being and thinking is it's more looking at this creation of an aspirational society. So, we tend to want to talk about the big things that we could do. But this first year, given the global realities and the local realities, I think there's going to be a much greater focus on bread and butter issues because a lot of persons in this country right now are simply trying to survive, and that has been a reality that I've had to face this year. I'm telling you, the overwhelming response for basic items and food support, that sort of thing, it has really been heartbreaking to watch, and you're unsure how to get this community in a space that we could be self-sufficient again, and I can imagine that will be replicated across the nation.
You think the Minister of Finance will be sensitive to those issues that you've raised?
Well, I certainly would hope so. I think we have, for the past 6 years or so, given this Minister of Finance a sort of pass by downplaying our expectations. And you would see the panic buying at the pump, and you would see all of these things because you anticipate not getting, not necessarily good news, but you are expecting an increased cost of living without a subsequent increase in service delivery from the government, from the executive. And I think that as a nation, we have to start to hold the government to account. The budget isn't simply him telling us what he expects from us as a nation by way of taxes or any sort of increased cost, but also to account for what you have spent and to tell the nation where you intend to invest, that we, the people of this country, will see intended benefits over time, a short-term, medium-term, and long-term plan. And I think if we cannot hold him to this high standard and we keep saying, we don't expect much, I, for one, am going in there expecting him to account not just for the last year, but for his tenure, and to say, this is what we have to do now. This is the returns as a nation that you can expect in the short term. This is what we expect to gain in the medium term. Because for far too long, we've just been hearing, tighten your belt, rocky road, but they're the government. So there's their policy positions that they can take to create a better environment for our citizens. And I'm going there expecting to hear that, and then expecting to have a debate based on what they would have presented and what we as a nation can expect in terms of development over the coming year and few years.
The current Minister of Finance, Mr. Colm Imbert, he has presented 6 budgets to the Parliament so far. Now, 5 of those budgets were pre-COVID. The 6th budget was in the COVID period. But none of those 5 budgets before in the pre-COVID period got us to growth or recovery. And the 6th budget, of course, was a distress budget, a budget that had to deal with the distress. One of the things, you talk about distress in your community, in your constituency, and I'm sure the level of distress in your constituency probably surprised you. In spite of the panic, you probably didn't think it would be that bad, but it was, because I think that is the condition almost everywhere we go. Do you think, and I mean, we can't basically be giving hampers to people for the next 5 years. So the question is, I mean, he has to have some kind of revival and recovery program. Do you expect to see this from the minister? And what would you expect to see as part of that package from your point of view, representing your own position as a member of the opposition?
Yeah. Well, my maiden contribution in the Senate was in 2017, a response to the budget as well. And I don't know if you recall, but that year was painted as the recovery. That was when the turnaround. We were told that the things we were going to begin seeing clearer now and that the difficult time had passed. And then we lived through 2017, 2018, 2019, all pre-COVID. And this turnaround that we were told about, it just never materialized. And so where I sit now as a member of the House of Representatives and having the responsibility to represent not just my own views or the views of the party that I represent, but the views of tens of thousands of persons who live within this community. I'm looking on and I've taken the approach of saying that for far too long we have accepted decisions from decision makers without them being required to show they're working. You know, in primary school, basic math, you have to show you're working. How did you arrive at this solution? And yet, still, when we face big decisions, national decisions, you are handed a decision and nobody shows you this is how we arrived at making this decision. So I've been very focused on data driven policies. Give us the statistics, give us the data, give us the inputs that you had, that you used as a policymaker to arrive at this decision that you are now asking a parliamentarian, opposition as I am, to support or not support, because that's the only way we can have any sort of constructive criticism, constructive critique, or constructive discourse. Because when you are being told, and I'll use the education sector for example, in the beginning of the pandemic, we were just given a number, 65,000 persons without devices. By the end of that year, change in terms of the leadership in the ministry and the number didn't change significantly. You had donations, the Adopt a School program, you had various programs, you had announcements in in the last budget for fiscal 2021, you had the discussion of MiFi programs, you had a discussion of connectivity, getting laptop. And then by the time we hit the mid-year review, the numbers again were arbitrarily given to us, but it showed no significant change in terms of connectivity. And it showed a government that really did not cater to making sensible data-driven approaches because they aren't in the business of collecting and studying the data, as it were, to make these decisions. So we end up with very, very arbitrary decision making, and I'm seeing it clearly in the education sector because I've been given the opportunity to shadow that sector. But I think that as well can be replicated across ministries where you see we're told that they're presenting a solution, but a year later when we assess it, no, so it didn't solve any of the problems that we were facing.
I mean, the UNC administration, when it was in office as the People's Partnership, they had a policy of laptops for every child, and it was I would say an enlightened policy which anticipated the fact that a lot of education and learning would take place online for the child, and a lot of the education would be, you might say, self-discovery as well. Now, that policy was altered by this government for financial reasons, and therefore this was not seen as a priority. But in a way, COVID created the conditions in which everybody, everywhere, no matter what your condition, had to have, or their children in whatever country, migrate to the technology of communications that is necessary in order to simply survive. A lot of homeschooling had to take place online, and that has transformed the system. Since then, the Ministry of Education has really scrambled to make devices available to everybody. I don't know what the situation is, but I think that they are making a genuine effort to do it. I don't know how successful it is. Do you think that we have accelerated the movement to technology-driven education enough, given the fact that ground was lost, I would say, for several years, 3 or 4 years, and now trying to recover in this COVID pandemic? And what do they need to do now in the education sector with the technology to make sure that children can get their education?
Yeah, well, not to belabor the point about the ground being lost, but I think it needs to be clear in the minds of citizens as well what that actually means for us. So the People's Partnership government began a program of getting devices, the hardware, into the hands of students. And so that is a very important and very critical first step, access to devices, because that equals access to opportunity. It creates a more equitable playing field for those who simply cannot afford. Had that program been continued, we would not be starting in the pandemic from the space of hardware. Had that program been improved upon, you would have had teachers, principals, educators across the board designing a curriculum around a more digital country, a digital economy. You would have been able to get past the starting point of the hardware and into the meat of the matter in terms of creating a type of student, creating a type of learning environment where you can maximize what these devices can do. And so I think that needs to just stay in the minds of persons. That is not so much about whether or not they scrap the laptop program, but that they put nothing else in place, and that we were going through 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, pretending as if access to technology would not form a critical part of the lives of these children. And then you had the pandemic, and that erased any discussion as to whether or not it ought to be a priority. It became the only way for us to access in education. It became the only option. And then now, yes, rightfully so, you had the scrambling. But because we had reset to the point of hardware, we could not begin to think about connectivity. So you were getting laptops to students, and students in my constituency and constituencies across the country in certain regions who could not get access to online, to the internet. There was no connectivity. And so you were still left out. And then once you've solved those problems, you now have an issue of the curriculum. Is it sufficient to say that you take a paper-based in-person curriculum and you just find a way to slap it online and that be sufficient? Absolutely not. And so the reset was one thing, but it created a space for us where, as a nation, we were not thinking about how to maximize our potential in terms of the digital space. We had reset, we were restarting, and we were now in the plane. We were running at a disadvantage in this race. And so, as we go forward, I fully expect that the ministry needs to continue to do its work to get persons connected and get the hardware situation solved. But I don't think that they need to look at that as a way of saying they've accomplished something, where they need to be solely focused as well. Their main priority needs to be maximizing our curriculum, working with our stakeholders in the education sector to create a space where the fullest potential of our teachers and our students can be met. Because the world is no longer first world and third world, it is digital and analog. The faster you can maximize the potential of your citizens in the digital spaces, the more progress we will see as a nation. And I don't think it is sufficient to create a ministry and say that you've done something. How is the Ministry of Digitization working with the Ministry of Education? Where are the cross appeals? What does it mean for training with for teachers, for training for persons in the education sector? And these are the big questions that we need to look at. While the ministry continues to work diligently, I hope, in terms of solving a connectivity problem, they need to do the absolute bigger work of creating a space that we can maximize our potential. And they can only do so, I believe, if they begin serious work of data collection and analyzing the data and studying it and then applying it to policy making, and not a quick fix of announcing something, making some big announcement like the reopening of school, and then having everybody play catch up. There needs to be a very deliberate, very studied approach, and you need to encourage stakeholder dialogue, but we need to start talking about moving forward and stop merely trying to survive in this space. And I think that's what we should all be hoping to hear as we go through this budget debate.
The teachers union have taken a position that if teachers are teaching face-to-face in school, they don't want them to be teaching as well online. Do you think that is a reasonable position? And how do we, in the face of vaccinated and unvaccinated students, create the conditions for resolution of the main challenge, which is to get all our children to get a decent education?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that problem we would not have been facing that problem today had the ministry adopted an approach where they focus on consultation with key stakeholders. Very early on, once receiving the opportunity to shadow the education ministry, I began speaking with persons who are not just key decision makers, but who live in and work in the education sector. And they've always known a hybrid system where you're asking the same teacher to do both online and in person would have been a difficult space. And they have been articulating that so it's not a simply a matter of recording the online proceedings and then transmitting it to students who are at home, because you're talking connectivity setup, camera setup, positioning. I mean, when we're hosting, I'm visiting with you here virtually, but it takes a lot of setting up to do this. And if you have to do that by the change of each class, I mean, you have unreasonable ask from these teachers, and they would have told the ministry that very early on. And I think it is unfair to paint teachers as having of not wanting to do something when they're simply saying it isn't feasible. It is, in some instances, the schools are physically not equipped to do that, and therefore they would need either extra planning or a whole extra day where they would record the classes on the weekend. So it is double, in some cases triple the work to be able to facilitate that. And when you're talking about the reopening of schools, you're talking about it in the context of the vaccination and whether or not students are vaccinated. And you're doing so without the necessary spaces created to build trust so that persons were more willing to be vaccinated. And I think we created a very, very tricky situation because persons are genuinely afraid. And we've been during this pandemic, you've been afraid of the virus, you have been taught all the social distancing rules and whatnot. And then there are persons who are genuinely afraid to take the vaccine or to expose their children to the vaccine. And while I am vaccinated myself, I respect and I listen to persons who have a genuine fear. But if we take a state policy of berating persons because they are hesitant or genuinely afraid, I don't think you're going to get the results that you want. And even when you say, okay, well, we're opening schools, but if you're unvaccinated, stay home without creating a space for respectful dialogue, where you explain to people, listen, in this pandemic of the unvaccinated, as they keep, as it were, the person who has to be most afraid now is the person who is unvaccinated, because those of us who may have gotten a vaccine may be asymptomatic, walking around, less likely to be tested, less likely to show symptoms. You, as an unvaccinated person, you are at risk as we reopen this space more and more, because the chances of you getting the virus and having a more negative reaction are higher. But we've done, instead of doing that, you're saying, listen, you want your child to go out to school, vaccinate them. Or is they not going back out to school? I mean, then people kind of, dig in their heels and say, well, I'm not doing that. And that's where we are as a society right now. We're in a very combative space. We are we have, and this is, and I genuinely believe this, because of the way the government has communicated certain things, we are in a combative space. The space for dialogue is dissipating quickly, and we are going to end up with very serious problems if we cannot have respectful conversations with each other and find a way to move forward.
All right, I'm going to ask you a final question now as we get to the news. You have the budget today. You're going to be sitting in Parliament listening. What are 3 or 4 priorities you'd like to see in the budget? List them quickly, and if necessary, we'll follow for a minute.
Right. Well, in terms of priorities, I want to hear what is the space to stabilize the economy. I want to hear what the government intends to do to incentivize small businesses and get us back onto an entrepreneurial track in any which way. I want to hear about the government's intended expenditure in terms of infrastructure, and that is from a constituency space as well, because I am facing a significant amount of infrastructural decay, which has made connectivity next to impossible in some instances in my constituency. And then I want to hear very quickly what they intend to do with any additional money collected via taxation, because it's one thing to talk about how you intend to earn revenue, but I want to hear very specifically what citizens can expect in terms of improved service delivery, be it from public utilities, and all of these things. So I'm really looking at. Go ahead.
I was going to ask you, you expect further taxation than the property tax?
Well, no, I don't, but I expect that he is going to come to us and announce how much revenue is expected to be earned, and why it is important to why they believe it is important for the property tax and the revenue authority in terms of, in their opinion, improved tax collection. But when you finish that point, I expect, and I hope we all expect that Minister Input will tell us what benefit to the citizen any of these extra taxes or improved tax collection would mean for the citizens of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and how they intend to measure.
I get the feeling that government accountability, Minister of Finance accountability, and performance measurement are important to you. Is that true?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Thank you very much, Anita Haynes, Member of Parliament for Tabaquite. We're very happy that you came and we had this conversation. Another time we will talk again. Okay? You have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for watching. That was Anita Haynes, the Member of Parliament for the UNC in Tabaquite. And we had a good conversation on several matters, including the budget and education. And we move on now to Andrew Chan and the news.